The nurse worked with the quiet monotony of someone used to their patients being more like furniture than people. Charles Albright, the man sitting catatonically in the corner, hadn't spoken a word in 2 decades. His hair, once dark, was now a stark silver, thin and brittle. His hollowed eyes stared out at nothing, his face a mask of apathy. Charles had been like this for 20 years, ever since the incident that no one seemed to know much about. She opened his battered suitcase to pack his belongings for the room transfer. Inside were clothes, neatly folded but old and yellowed with age, and beneath them, a small leather-bound diary. The nurse hesitated, curiosity tugging at her. She cast a glance at Charles, who didn't react. Slowly she opened the diary and her eyes began to scan the scrawled handwriting within. The offer to join the expedition has just come and I'm torn. At 50 years old, I'm no stranger to adventure, but this feels different. The briefings are vague, almost deliberately so. They say it's a government-sponsored project but don't elaborate. The secrecy is palpable, yet the allure of Antarctica, the ultimate frontier, wins me over. After decades of studying ancient tectonic shifts, I can't resist the chance to uncover secrets buried beneath the ice. Also, the money is substantial, enough to make the secrecy bearable. We landed at the base on a military transport plane. The cold is like nothing I'd ever felt, a piercing, bone-deep freeze that no amount of gear can protect against. The ice stretches endlessly in every direction, a white desert beneath a pale, sunless sky. The base looms ahead, half buried in the ice, a cluster of prefabricated buildings dwarfed by the vast emptiness around us. The team gathered in the briefing room this morning, tension thick in the air. We were 10 in total, each an expert in our field. Dr. Patel, a microbiologist. Dr. Green, a biologist. Dr. Hayes, a physicist. Dr. Mercer, the expedition leader, who remained an enigma to us all. Others like myself, a geologist, a doctor, and specialists in infectious diseases and engineering. None of us knew why we'd been chosen or the purpose of the mission. Dr. Mercer wasted no time. He flicked on a projector and the grainy image that appeared made my stomach drop. It showed a massive, jagged structure buried deep under the ice, its angles alien and unnatural. This structure, he said, has been beneath the Antarctic ice for at least 500,000 years. We don't know where it came from or what it's made of. What we do know is this: it's alive. The room fell silent. Our first task has been to begin drilling into the ice to collect samples. The site is over a mile from the base, connected by a series of prefabricated tunnels. The drilling team works in shifts. The ice is dense, but the deeper we go, the stranger it becomes. The layers aren't consistent with natural formations. Instead, the ice appears melted and refrozen in patterns that defied logic. It was late when I was called to the lab. Dr. Patel was standing over a microscope, her face pale. "You need to see this," she said. I leaned over the slide, peering through the lens. Under the microscope was a sample of ice from the deepest layer we'd reached. Inside were tiny cells, perfectly preserved. "They're biological," she said, "and they're moving." I stepped back, disbelief flooding through me. "That's impossible. These cells should be frozen solid." Patel shook her head, her eyes wide with fear. "I've run every test. They're alive. Not just preserved, they're active." The cells pulsed faintly under the microscope, almost like they were reacting to being observed. This morning, the cells had doubled in size. They don't match anything in our biological databases. Dr. Green hypothesized they might be extremophiles, organisms that thrive in extreme conditions. But these cells are unlike any extremophiles we'd ever seen. "They're too complex," she said, pacing the lab. "This isn't just adaptation, this is design." I asked her what she meant, but she simply shook her head, refusing to elaborate. Tensions within the team are starting to rise. Dr. Hayes, the physicist, reported strange fluctuations in his instruments. "It's not just the cells," he said, his voice tight. "The structure itself is emitting something. Radiation, energy, I don't know what. It's bending the rules of physics, time, gravity, space. They're not behaving normally near it." Dr. Mercer dismissed his concerns. "Your job is to study it, not theorize," he snapped. "The air around the base feels heavier. Nights are becoming harder to endure." I began hearing faint vibrations, a low hum that seemed to emanate from the ice itself. The drilling team uncovered a tunnel leading down into the structure. The opening was jagged, but the tunnel walls were unnaturally smooth, as if melted into place. Dr. Mercer led us inside. The air grew colder the deeper we went, and a faint blue light emanated from the walls. I felt a gnawing sense of wrongness with every step. At the end of the tunnel was a doorway, seamlessly carved into the ice. It wasn't a natural formation. Beyond the doorway was a chamber, vast and alien. In its center was a sphere, black and glossy, hovering a foot above the ground. "What is this?" someone whispered. Dr. Mercer didn't answer. We were all speechless. Last night, I dreamt of the sphere. In the dream, I was standing in the chamber, watching as its surface rippled like liquid. I reached out to touch it, and a voice filled my head. Not a voice I could hear, but one I could feel. Hunger, rage, despair. I woke up drenched in sweat. Others are reporting similar dreams. The sphere is in all of them, calling to us, drawing us closer. Dr. Hayes locked himself in his lab this morning, muttering equations no one could understand. Dr. Green accused Dr. Patel of tampering with the samples, and Dr. Mercer grew increasingly volatile. Paranoia is consuming us. Fights are breaking out. By the evening, we'd become strangers to each other. Today, the killings began, and the base is in chaos. One by one, the others are turning on each other, or themselves. The sphere's pull is too strong. It is whispering promises of escape, of salvation, of power. I am trying to resist, barricading myself in my quarters. But the whispers found me. I am the last one left. The sphere is burning in my mind, an inescapable presence. I don't remember much after that, only light, endless light, and a voice that said one final word: awaken. The nurse closed the diary, her hands trembling. She looked at Charles, her breath catching as she saw tears streaming down his face. "It's awake," he whispered, the first words he had spoken in 20 years. When I agreed to join the pipeline repair team in Siberia, I thought the biggest challenges would be the cold and the isolation. The idea of spending weeks in one of the most remote places on Earth didn't scare me. I liked the quiet. I liked being far from other people. What I didn't expect was the fear. It started 3 days after we arrived. The camp was small, just me, Victor, and Grigory. We were sent to fix a section of the gas pipeline that had frozen and cracked during an unusually harsh winter. We stayed in a prefabricated shelter near the worksite, surrounded by miles of flat, endless snow. It was the kind of place where silence pressed down on you, heavy and thick. Even the wind seemed muted, its howl swallowed by the endless white. On the third night, I woke up to a sound I couldn't place. It was faint, almost like a child crying. I lay there listening, trying to convince myself it was just the wind. But the sound didn't waver or fade like the wind does. It stayed constant, soft, high-pitched, and full of pain. The logical part of me said it was impossible. There wasn't anyone for miles. But the longer I listened, the harder it became to ignore. Eventually, I threw on my coat and boots and stepped outside, flashlight in hand. The air was so cold it burned my lungs, and the snow crunched loudly under my feet as I walked. "Hello?" I called out, my voice cracking in the stillness. The crying stopped. The next morning, I told Victor and Grigory about what I'd heard. Grigory, the younger of the two, just shrugged. "It's the ice," he said. "When the temperature drops fast, the ice contracts and shifts. It can sound like a scream." I nodded, trying to let his explanation sink in. But Victor didn't look convinced. He was older, with deep lines etched into his face from years of working in the cold. He leaned in closer, lowering his voice. "You heard," he said. I frowned. "What do you mean?" He hesitated, glancing at Grigory as if to make sure he wasn't listening. "There's an old story," Victor said. "The Nanet's people, reindeer herders, believe that the snow can trap the souls of the dead. If someone dies in the cold without a proper burial, their spirit becomes trapped beneath the ice. Sometimes, on quiet nights, you can hear them calling." I stared at him, waiting for the punchline, but Victor's face stayed serious. "You're joking," I said, but my voice lacked confidence. "Stay inside at night," he said, "and don't listen to the cries." That night, I couldn't sleep. I lay in my bunk, staring at the ceiling, Victor's words looping in my mind. Outside, the wind picked up, rattling the walls of the shelter. Then I heard it again. It was faint at first, blending with the wind. But as I focused, it grew clearer, a soft, mournful wail. My chest tightened, my pulse quickened. It didn't sound like ice, it sounded like a person. I squeezed my eyes shut, trying to block it out. But the crying grew louder, more desperate. It was coming from just outside the shelter. I couldn't take it anymore. Throwing off my blanket, I grabbed my flashlight and stormed to the door. "What are you doing?" Victor's voice stopped me. He was sitting up in his bunk, his eyes wide with fear. "I'm going to check," I said. "No," he said firmly. "Don't go out there." "What if someone's hurt?" "There's no one out there," Victor said. "It's not a person." The next morning, Grigory was gone. We found his boots near the edge of the worksite, half buried in the snow. His footprints led away from the camp, heading toward the endless white. We called his name, searched the perimeter, but there was no sign of him. Just those lonely footprints, disappearing into the horizon. "He must have heard it," Victor said, his voice trembling. "The cries." That night the wailing returned, louder than before. It echoed through the shelter, seeping into my ears no matter how hard I tried to block it out. I sat by the small heater, gripping a mug of coffee, trying to keep my hands from shaking. Victor paced back and forth, muttering to himself. "Why does it sound so human?" I asked finally. Victor stopped pacing, his face pale. "Because it wants you to follow," he said. "It wants to trap you." The heater sputtered, and for a moment the room plunged into darkness. When the lights flickered back on, Victor was staring at the door. "I can feel it," he whispered. "It's close." In the middle of the night I woke to the sound of footsteps. At first I thought it was Victor, but when I turned I saw his bunk was empty, the blanket tossed aside. The footsteps weren't coming from inside the shelter. They were coming from above. My blood ran cold as I realized something, or someone, was walking on the roof. "Victor?" I called out, but my voice barely rose above a whisper. The footsteps stopped. Slowly I reached for the flashlight by my bed. My hand shook as I clicked it on and aimed the beam at the ceiling. The footsteps started again, faster this time, racing back and forth across the roof, and then I heard the crying. The sound was deafening now, no longer faint or distant. It surrounded me, filling the room, echoing in my skull. I clamped my hands over my ears, but it didn't help. "Victor!" I shouted, panic rising in my chest. The door burst open, snow swirling inside as the wind howled. I turned the flashlight toward the doorway, but the beam illuminated nothing but white. And then I saw them. Footprints, forming in the snow, one after another, leading into the shelter. But there was no one there. The lights flickered again, and the crying turned to laughter, low, guttural, and inhuman. I backed away, my heart hammering in my chest, the flashlight shaking in my grip. The footprints stopped just inside the doorway, and the air grew unbearably cold. "Who's there?" I demanded, my voice cracking. The laughter stopped. For a moment there was silence. Then a voice, low and rasping, spoke from the shadows. "You followed." The lights went out completely. When I woke, the shelter was empty. The heater was off, the coffee mug frozen solid, and the snow had begun to drift inside through the open door. There was no sign of Victor. Outside, the footprints led away from the shelter, disappearing into the horizon. The crying was gone, but the silence felt worse. I stood there, staring into the endless white, knowing I was alone, or at least I thought I was. Behind me, faint and soft, I heard the first crunch of snow under footsteps. The first time I heard the sound, I thought it was the wind. Living alone in a cabin deep in the Alaskan wilderness, you get used to the noises nature makes. Branches creaking, snow shifting, the howls of distant wolves. But this wasn't like any wind I'd ever heard. It was low and guttural, almost like a growl, carried on the air in a way that made my skin crawl. I dismissed it at first, pulling my wool blanket tighter around my shoulders and stoking the fire. Nights here were long and cold, and the isolation could make your mind play tricks on you. But then it came again, louder this time, closer. The cabin is a simple place, little more than a single room with a wood stove, a small kitchen, and a cot in the corner. I built it myself years ago when I decided to leave the noise of the modern world behind. It's a hard life, but a peaceful one, or at least it was. The growling became a regular occurrence over the next few nights, always starting after the sun dipped below the horizon. At first it stayed distant, echoing through the trees. Then it started coming closer, circling the cabin like a predator stalking its prey. I told myself it was a wolf, or maybe a bear, drawn by the scent of food. But deep down, I knew it wasn't. 2 nights ago it began scratching at the walls. I'd just finished cleaning up after dinner when I heard it. A slow, deliberate scrape against the wood, like claws dragging down the side of the cabin. My heart jumped into my throat as I grabbed the rifle I kept by the door. "Get out of here!" I yelled, throwing open the door and pointing the barrel into the dark. The night was silent except for the whisper of the wind through the trees. My breath came out in frosty clouds as I scanned the shadows, my finger hovering over the trigger. but there was nothing there. I locked the door and bolted it for good measure, but sleep didn't come easy that night. Every creak of the cabin, every gust of wind against the windows, set my nerves on edge. Last night was worse. It started with footsteps on the roof. I was sitting by the fire trying to distract myself with an old book when I heard it, a soft thud, followed by the unmistakable sound of something walking across the shingles. I froze, my ears straining to make sense of the sound. It moved slowly, deliberately, like it knew I was listening. Grabbing the rifle, I stepped outside, the snow crunching under my boots. The cabin's roof was dark against the starless sky, but nothing moved. The forest was silent, the kind of oppressive silence that presses against your ears and makes you feel like you're being watched. As I circled the cabin, the footsteps followed me, always just out of sight, just beyond the edge of the roof. When I finally went back inside, I felt the eyes on me before I even closed the door. Tonight, the growling has returned, louder than ever. It circles the cabin, closer than it's ever been. I sit in the center of the room, the rifle resting across my lap, the fire crackling weakly in the stove. My breath fogs in the cold air. The fire doesn't seem to hold the chill at bay anymore. The growling stops, and for a moment the silence is deafening. Then comes the scratching. It starts low near the base of the walls and works its way up as though whatever is out there is testing the strength of the cabin. A loud thud shakes the roof and my heart leaps into my throat. It's on top of the cabin now, moving in slow, heavy steps. I aim the rifle at the ceiling, my hands trembling. "What do you want?" I shout, my voice cracking. The only answer is a low, rumbling laugh that sends a shiver down my spine. The roof creaks under its weight as it moves toward the chimney. My stomach drops as I realize what it's doing. It's trying to get in. Grabbing a log from the fire, I shove it into the stove, stoking the flames until they roar. Smoke billows up the chimney, and for a moment the footsteps stop. Then comes a scream, high-pitched and inhuman, followed by a heavy thud as it leaps off the roof. I rush to the window, my breath fogging the glass as I peer out into the darkness. For a moment I think I see something, a shadow, tall and gangly, with two long limbs and glowing eyes that pierce the night. It stares at me for what feels like an eternity before vanishing into the trees. The silence that follows is almost worse than the noise. I sit by the fire, the rifle clutched tightly in my hands, waiting for it to return. Hours pass, the fire burns low, and the shadows in the cabin grow longer. Every creak of the wood, every gust of wind outside makes me jump. And then I hear it. Not growling, not scratching, but whispering. It's faint at first, just on the edge of hearing, but it grows louder, more insistent. The words are guttural and strange, a language I can't understand. It's coming from the roof again. The whispers seep into my mind, filling my head with images I can't explain. A forest shrouded in mist. A clearing filled with bones. A creature standing at the center, its eyes glowing with a malevolent light. I stagger to my feet, clutching the rifle like a lifeline. The whispers are inside me now, coiling around my thoughts like a serpent. The fire dies completely, plunging the cabin into darkness. The door bursts open with a deafening crash, and the freezing night air rushes in. My ears ring from the sound and I fumble with the rifle, aiming it at the empty doorway. For a moment nothing happens. The wind howls through the open door and the snow swirls inside, but the threshold remains empty. Then it steps inside. It's taller than the doorway, hunched to fit through the frame. Its limbs are too long, its body impossibly thin, its skin black and glossy like wet stone. The glowing eyes from the forest burn into me, freezing me in place. The whispers stop, replaced by a low guttural growl that reverberates through the cabin. I fire the rifle, the sound deafening in the confined space. The creature jerks backward, but it doesn't fall. Instead, it straightens, its head cocking to one side as if amused. It moves faster than I can react, swiping the rifle from my hands with a single motion. I stumble back, falling against the stove. The creature looms over me, its eyes burning brighter. For a moment, I think this is it. This is how it ends. But then it stops. It leans closer, its face inches from mine, and I hear it whisper one word, clear, sharp, and human. Run! I don't wait to understand. I bolt from the cabin, my boots slipping on the icy floor. Behind me I hear the creature's growl, but it doesn't follow. I run into the forest, the freezing wind biting at my skin, the glowing eyes of the cabin fading into the distance. The whispers are gone now, but they've left something behind. A feeling that I will never be truly alone again. Thanks for watching, good nightmares and stay scared.